Hello and welcome to Miniature Adventures. I'm Big Lee, and this week I want to talk about guilty pleasures, those uncommon periods that we either like to play or would love to play if only we could find the figures. So you'll have to excuse me a little bit this week. It's extremely hot up here in the operations room, and I have a stinking cold, which is ridiculous at this time of year, but there you are. Anyway, so today's video is actually inspired by a conversation I had with Scott Duncan at Broadside a week or so ago. He was there with Crawley Wargames Club, and he was running a game, Seek Wars I think it was, and we got chatting, and he suggested a video for the show, and he basically said, what's your guilty pleasure? And then we got a little bit chatting about it, and he was basically saying, what is the period that you really love to play? Now, it could be a period that you do play, that's perhaps a little bit niche and a bit more, less common amongst other wargamers, shall we say. Or it could be a period that you'd love to play if only someone made the rules for them, or a set of models for them. Or maybe you've managed to find a period and play it because you do a load of conversions. We're talking about off the beaten track type periods. But in particular, those ones that you don't often see in the War Games magazines or on people's blogs and so on. And when after the show we'd all packed up, and very hot day, as I think I mentioned in my show video, when we got back to Stuart's to unpack all our stuff from our game, we sat down with our usual post-show cup of tea and had a little quick chat about it. And I've been chatting with some of the guys as well during the week, but I'll come back to what the rejects' guilty pleasures are at the end of the video. So Scott, unsurprisingly, put in a bid for Wargaming in India, as that's what his group was doing. And I'll actually read what Stuart said, rather than paraphrasing. First, he says, it's very colourful. How often do you get a unit in orange or with red bear skins? You can have elephants, not just one, but whole herds of pachyderms. Camels, yep. Rockets, yep. Exploding rockets and the stampeding elephants, of course. Do you want to play Skirmish? Read the two Sharp novels set in India, Sharp's Tiger and Sharp's Triumph, and anything set in the Khyber Pass. Big battles in the period 1740 to 1850, there were big battles up to 50,000 people taking part. That's about the size of some of Wellington's peninsular battles. And of course, the Duke, the man who would become the Duke of Wellington, learned his craft in India. Historical background, of course, buckets of real history. From Clive through to the Mutiny, semi-historical, Flashman and Sharp. Vague historical, did I mention the Russian invasion of the Punjab in 1765? Or you can even have a club campaign raising your own armies, just like the systems used by mercenary captains in the 1770s or the 1840s. Check out Benoit de Boyne. I'm not sure what that means, but that's what he said. And of course, figures, you can go everything from 6mm, 15mm, 25mm, whatever. There's lots of choices. So he finally ended on, so go dig into this mountain of light and fill your boots. So that was his suggestion. So as I mentioned at the start of the video, the Rejects had a good chat about this afterwards, and we've been sort of messaging each other during the week, putting various suggestions forward, some of them quite amusing actually. It turns out that we all have our little guilty pleasures, a period that we really enjoy more than any other, and maybe they're not necessarily mainstream. So, Richard, for instance, nominated his early French Wars of Religion collection. It's a period that covers a lot of history, but in the early time period that he's covering, there doesn't seem to be a lot of coverage of it. So Richard's not only put together 2mm armies to play this period, but he's written his own set of rules, which are really, really good. Still testing them and fleshing them out and working on the detail, but I think they work really, really well. And certainly that sort of period, that early Renaissance period, just coming out of medieval warfare, does seem to be a little bit underrepresented by mainstream rules and mini manufacturers. I mean, there are some rule sets that cover wide periods of time, but nothing specific to that, or nothing that leaps to mind anyway that covers that period, and certainly something that I haven't seen before. So it's a period that's unusual to us. So that's his guilty pleasure. Ray, unsurprisingly, nominated his Haitian Rebellion collection. Again, a period that doesn't seem to be played a lot. I mean, I've not seen anything in the Wargames magazines. Maybe I've missed it, but possibly it's a conflict that is perhaps a little bit controversial because it's born out of the slave trade and all of that activity in that area. So maybe it's a contentious period for some, and maybe they don't want to play it for that reason. But the same could be said for World War II or in any period in history. So maybe that's a drag factor on that period being more popular. I don't know, but certainly Ray seems to have really gone into a lot of detail. And he's managed to find suitable models, make some conversions, and he's got his forces together, and we're hoping that we can convince him to put on a game at some point. Now, my guilty pleasure, now this is a difficult one because obviously I'm really invested in all the stuff that I've collected, but I would have to say it's my LRDG stuff, and the covert war that's been fought out in the desert behind enemy lines. I just find it endlessly fascinating. It's proper boys' own stuff. It's a difficult period to wargame, particularly when it's set against the backdrop of these big battles going on, Alamein and all the rest, and all this wide, regular fighting between these massive armies over hundreds of miles of barren desert, and then you've got these little groups doing little raids and stuff. So it's actually, I think it's quite difficult to wargame. You think it's a skirmish game because there's so few figures involved, but they're covering vast distances. So how do you reconcile a skirmish game with shorter distances on the table and so on? So it's a really difficult. I think it's a difficult one to wargame. That's why I do it in 6mm. I think you can get a bit more out of that. And I'd refer you have a look at my Barche raid game. I've done a video report of that, Operation Caravan. So look that up. It's on the channel to see how I sort of had a go at it. I certainly think it's a little bit off the beaten track. And a period that occasionally comes up, but I'm never quite convinced at the way that it's portrayed in some rules. It's either overly simplistic or too complicated, and I think it's an underrepresented but fascinating period of the war. And like I say, it gets drowned out a little bit by the bigger battles going on behind it and in the landscape around it. And then during the week, while chatting with some of the other rejects, of course, we got a chance to discuss their guilty pleasures. And I'm not entirely sure whether this was deliberately tongue-in-cheek just to wind Ray up, but a couple of the rejects definitely expressed an interest for something Star Wars. A little bit of sci-fi, and even the suggestion that they've got all the materials they need to bring us one of those games into the shed of war. Poor old Ray's going to have an aneurysm. I'm not entirely sure how they're going to convince Stuart Posty to allow us to bring sci-fi into his precious history shed. I'm certainly up for a game of that. I'd give it a go. I love the films, I love sci-fi, I love reading sci-fi. I haven't played a lot of sci-fi, it has to be said. So I'm quite happy to give it a go. I love my history, and I do love being a historical wargamer, but I've got nothing against playing something else. So that might be an interesting one. Definitely a guilty pleasure for some, again, amongst a group that prides itself on being a historical war games group, and exclusively a historical war games group. And there are certain members of the group who will probably struggle to cope with the game if they have to be brought in to do a little bit of sci-fi. We'll see. If we ever do one, I will be sure to take some pictures and do a bit of filming and bring you the struggles of Ray onto the screen, the little screen of Miniature Adventures TV. So of course this brings me to the bit where I say, what about you? What are your guilty pleasures? Is there an off the beaten track period that you would either do play or would love to play, if only they made the figures, that you think perhaps is underrepresented on the table, but you find fantastic? Is there a range of models that you wish someone made for a particular period? And we're not talking about one unit for an existing period that maybe you'd love to see. But I'm talking about a range. Is there a gap in there, a range for a particular period of history that you think is missing? Or are you quite happy to take an existing range and make the conversions to make them suitable for the period? Or maybe you're quite happy to play with things that aren't quite right just so you can play your period. I don't know, I'd love to hear from you. Is there a particular battle, for instance, that you find endlessly fascinating, that you think has been underrepresented within the hobby? And as usual, please, I'd love to hear from you in the answers below. So please leave some comments, and we can explore this question together. And thanks again to Scott for the suggestion. It's been a really fun one to explore, and hopefully it's made for an interesting video. So of course, if you did like the video, please like, subscribe and share. And of course, if you want to keep up to date with my content, please tap the bell notification icon. So until next week, stay safe, keep gaming, and of course, keep rolling high.